Hi, it's Searching for Answers again, and we're glad you're back with us again. We're in the book of Esther still, and working our way through where the plot really unfolds all its potential now, because we're getting into chapter 8 of Esther. So while you get your Bible, let's introduce ourselves and we'll get started. Along the way here, Bernard Taylor from the pastoral staff of Loma Linda University Church, Leo Ranzelin from the Faculty of Religion, the School of Religion here at Loma Linda, Laura Garrigues, the chair of the English department at La Sierra University. My name is John Jones, and I'm in the Divinity School at La Sierra University. So we're well balanced tonight between Loma Linda and La Sierra, as we should be. Here we are, chapter 8. And Laura, let me invite you to take us down through, let us say verses 3 through whatever, maybe 3 through 8 or so,
all right,
and see how that goes for us.
Now Esther spoke again to the king, fell down at his feet, and implored him with tears to counteract the evil of Haman the Agagite and the scheme which he had devised against the Jews. And the king held out the golden scepter towards Esther. So Esther arose and stood before the king and said, "If it pleases the king, and if I've found favor in his sight, and the thing seems right to the king, and I am pleasing to his eyes, let it be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, the son of Hammedatha the Agagite, which he wrote to annihilate the Jews who are in all the king's provinces. For how can I endure to see the evil that will come to my people? Or how can I endure to see the destruction of my countrymen?" Then King Ahasuerus said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "Indeed, I have given Esther the house of Haman, and they have hanged him on the gallows because he tried to lay his hands on the Jews. You yourselves write a decree concerning the Jews, as you please, in the king's name, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For whatever is written in the king's name and sealed with the king's signet ring, no one can revoke."
This king really does delegate, doesn't he? How do you feel about that?
Everything but the banqueting, right?
What jumps out at you as you work down through these verses? This is the New King James Version,
Correct.
Isn't it? Yeah.
What strikes me is some of the parallels that we saw in to chapter 7. We have yet another speech, yet another series of phrases where Esther is checking with the king, you know, have I pleased you, if this, if that. The phrases pile up on one another, again, rhetorically. You would think at this point we were past that and we could kind of go to shorter speaking, but no, we're still in a situation where she's using all of her rhetorical skills. She even falls down at his feet.
Right.
I think in a way, the story might easily have stopped at the verse 2 of chapter 8. You know, we've kind of gotten rid of the bad guy.
Right.
The good have risen. They've inherited the earth, that sort of thing, with the passing of the house into the hands of Esther. But no, there's business to attend to.
Right.
There are politics that need to be addressed. And I think, as you very rightly pointed out, nothing that the king himself too much seems to want to bother with was one way of looking at it. On the other hand, this gesture of allowing them the opportunity to write their own laws really does signal that the height of power to which they've risen in this political situation.
Yeah, I think I would anticipate after verse 2 of chapter 8 that with Mordecai in possession of the ring, then he could do whatever he wanted to do. But this monarch seems to be like a lot of leaders, no surprises. Don't reverse this without due consultation and essentially declare war. If Mordecai had done this, then I think it would have quickly backfired. Esther has to work with Ahasuerus. And it's an entirely different world. And to me, there's nothing unnatural about that. That she has, on the one hand, she had her day, not unlike Elijah in Mount Carmel. He was there before and stood for it, and then he ran for his life. And that was the easy part. Haman's gone, but the law still stands. And that, I don't think, is stated here, but that's the underlying principle that we're now working through. How do we get around this? Because their life has been spared, but only for a time at the moment. There's still that ticking clock that will bring to the time that has already been set, and then, so what have we achieved? So now there is the real work to do.
Right.
The real negotiating begins.
Yeah, it's less than a year off. I don't know, 9 or 10 months. It looks like something like that. Yeah.
So the edict, as you say, still remains. That cannot be revoked. You know, Haman's edict, so to speak, that is to destroy the Jews. And so they have to tackle that. And I think on the part of Esther and Mordecai, there's this fear that they're dealing with an unpredictable, mercurial king who may not be persuaded by ethical arguments about the inappropriateness of an edict that sought to exterminate a group of people. Esther seems to realize that that kind of ethical argument is not going to work. So as you pointed out, her appeal and request is intensely personal. I'm so struck by it. If it pleases the king, and if I have won his favor, and if the thing seems right before the king, and if I have his approval, wow, that is unbelievable. The lengths that she's going to encourage the king to see things along her way. The other thing I'm struck with, and I must say I'm a bit bothered by it, Esther on the floor, weeping, begging and pleading
That's
for
where
her
we saw
life.
Haman not long before, isn't it?
Right.
That's
So
right.
I just wish she didn't need to resort to that kind of activity. And yet, seeing, as I just said, how unpredictable and mercurial the king is, maybe this is the strategy that she has to employ in this world.
No, I think that's very true. If we look at the last few words of chapter 7, verse 10, after they've sort of taken Haman away and hanged him, that chapter ends, and then the king's wrath subsided.
Right.
So the mercurial comment, I think, is very true. He's angry, he gets over it. You know, think about early in the story with his first wife, and he was angry, and then he kind of felt bad about it later. So I think Esther almost has to continuously generate that emotion from the king. Right? So maybe that prostrate position on the floor and the appeal that she has to go through, that she just knows that's what's required to get through this king's mind.
It gets back to a comment you made, I think, earlier, and that is she truly has an incredible grasp as to who this king is and what makes him tick.
Right.
She has figured him out.
I'm tempted to say has a full depth of knowledge of his shallowness, but I don't know, that might be taken.
That's clever. Well, the king is a king, and Esther as queen, and these courtiers as eunuchs, they know the limits, you know, and they each have to act a combination between wisely and cleverly. Yeah.
Right. I'm also struck, just very briefly, Bernard had been mentioning the ring again, and it struck me that this whole story has all of these items that stand in for the king. So the ring is one, his authority. We talked before about the robe and the horse that's crowned that was part of the episode earlier. So this king really is, he's almost, you can replace him with these objects. And I think it goes back to the diaspora Jewish sort of setting here, that he's kind of a caricature that is used in the plot for really the heroes who are the Jews to have their day.
And
Go ahead. If I can go back to verse 4, the king held out the golden scepter, and Esther rose and stood before the king. She said, 1, if it pleases the king, and 2, if I have won his favor, and 3, if the things seem right before the king, and that's the normal number. And then we have this one thrown in, and I have his approval.
Right.
Let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman, son of Hammedatha the Agagite. Now, two things. Notice the use of the jussive. That is a third-person command.
Let it be so.
Let it be so. The imperative is second person, and both of them are designed to get the recipient to follow the wishes of the speaker. One is direct, the other is indirect, and thereby impersonal. Let an order be written to revoke the letters devised by Haman. It's third person and therefore impersonal. And so she's put an idea out there, but it's out there, it's independent of her. And Hebrew has the jussive, well, has the name jussive. Greek also has the third person. But of late I've had an interest in this, and when I saw this here, and to see the force of her language, it's interesting. And then there's Haman's, his father, the Agagite. And just a reminder again, we have mentioned this earlier. In fact, I think it might have been the last session in 1 Samuel 15, where Saul is told to go and wipe out the Amalekites, and in accord with popular custom, he brought back the king, Agag the king, and Samuel was incensed with this. This must be 16, 1 Samuel 16. And so he has the famous words, what's the sound of this in my ears, and so on. Behold, to obey is better to sacrifice, and to hearken than the fat of rams. Now, whether this is genealogically a descendant, it is by name associated with that and puts it over there, but also brings to light some very, very old enemies.
Right.
And here are issues in diaspora, out there outside of Judea, way over there in Babylon, and there are those old issues that are still around and to be confronted. And an opportunity to retell that story, and Haman is dispatched and taken care of. So this is really a well-told story.
Indeed it is.
Fascinating.
You know, in this day and age of immigration into this country, we've often thought over the decades that people who were enemies of one another in some homeland across the sea in either direction, east, west, wherever, when they get here where the sky is bigger, we sometimes think maybe these things subside, and I believe that's been the case in many instances. But now as our country grows more crowded, we're beginning to see some of these flashpoints coming back up again, aren't we? Maybe some lessons for us here. Leo, you were looking at these verses, 3 through 8, and you had some interesting ideas you shared with us. Is there anything left that you want to pick up on that before we move on? I don't mean to put you on the spot, but...
Well, just that there has to be this counter edict to undo the earlier edict. And so part of me asks why. And so here I think perhaps we have a little bit of legalism, if you will. There's not this sense of the moral standing of law and of whether one should be concerned with the moral dimensions of law. It's just a law was made, and we've got to undo that. So I see a sense of legalism here being played out in
it's
this.
kind of a technical answer in a way, isn't it? Rather
I say, now wait a minute, what stands behind the law? And of course, for us, the biblical vision is the dignity and value of human beings created in the image of God. That is not at all in Persian law.
Right.
The dignity and value of the king and his signet. It seems that.
The other thing I would say is I just don't sense on the part of the king any aspect of moral responsibility of
Yeah.
recognizing the error of his ways, of having been played by Haman, and maybe he initiating the process to fix the problem. As you said earlier, he just delegates it. And that underscores for me the precarious nature that the Jewish people find themselves in, with having to deal with, you mentioned shallow, I would say hedonistic kind of a king.
Right.
Boy, that's you don't feel too secure in that kind of a world and environment.
True, but from a storytelling point of view, it's a good device because it really allows the Jews to step forward and be heroic.
Yeah.
While the more that he plays the kind of caricature of the potentate
Good point.
who's irrational and all that, then in contrast, they look more heroic, more logical. They're basically having to save themselves to kind of clean up his mess for him, that sort of thing.
And so, story world, narrative world, exactly. And so, for me, that raises the larger historical questions of Xerxes and his depiction here, because I think Herodotus and the historians suggest that Xerxes was not this unastute.
If we wanted to get really cynical, it's also not a bad administrative stratagem. Let your underlings take care of it. If the whole thing blows up in your face, you can blame them, fire them, say, well, if they did that, it's their fault, and you're kind of insulated a little.
That's right.
Leo, so verse 9, the king's secretaries, the scribes are called. Take us down through verse 14 or so, if the clock allows here.
The king's secretaries were summoned at that time in the 3rd month, which is the month of Sivan, on the 23rd day. And an edict was written according to all that Mordecai commanded to the Jews and to the satraps, and the governors and the officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, and also to the Jews in their script and their language. He wrote letters in the name of King Ahasuerus, sealed them with the king's ring, and sent them by mounted couriers riding on fast steeds, bred from the royal herd. By these letters, the king allowed the Jews who were in every city to assemble and defend their lives, to destroy, to kill, and to annihilate any armed force of any people or province that might attack them, with their children and women, and to plunder their goods on a single day throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, on the 13th day of the 12th month, which is the month of Adar. A copy of the writ was to be issued as a decree on every province and published to all peoples. And the Jews were to be ready on that day to take revenge on their enemies. And so the couriers, mounted on their swift royal steeds, hurried out, and urged by the king's command, the decree was issued in the citadel of Susa.
What do you think?
Well, a couple of things here. I'm struck by the multicultural nature of the Persian Empire.
It's stunning, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
So perhaps a little bit like America today. Lots of ethnic groups, which again coheres with what we know of history, that the Persians respected these different ethnic groups that lived within their borders, and as far as we can tell, gave them some degree of autonomy and freedom to live out their lives, right? So I'm struck by that, but I'm also struck by the fact that it's Mordecai now that kind of steps to the plate, and not Esther, and this is Mordecai's decree and command, and not Esther's. Like, are we moving back into this male-dominated world, and is Esther receding in the background? Not really sure. And then the other thing that perhaps ethically speaking begins to be quite problematic is Mordecai's actual decree, right? In essence, it picks up almost every element that we saw in chapter 3, and it includes, he doesn't leave off, alas, children and women.
No, and plunder.
So
You know, the language really is parallel. When we look at chapter 3, as you say,
Yeah.
verse 13, you've got it again, don't you? In chapter 9, here's Esther's words. Chapter 7, verse 4. 7:4. Here is Esther when she first reveals this thing to Xerxes. We have been sold, I and my people, again, destroyed, killed, annihilated. That triple emphasis. And again, in what you just read so well, Leo.
There it is.
Yeah, that the Jews now in every city to assemble and defend themselves, to destroy, kill, annihilate. So it is really full-scale, equal terms in a way, finally, isn't
That
it?
original edict seems
Yeah.
to have truly imprinted upon Esther and Mordecai.
Yeah.
We're back to that math equation, the equivalency
Yeah.
of things. Yeah.
Isn't that interesting? Yeah.
So what does one do with this bloodthirstiness, vindictiveness on the part of Mordecai now that he has the authority and power to counteract the edict?
Well,
I'm not
women
sure
and
there's a-
children are liable, and plunder is at stake here. When the story actually plays out, we read that the plunder is spared. You know,
Right.
they don't do that. So there is a little bit of an ethical one-upmanship, a little bit there, isn't there? Yeah.
But could this also be back with respect to the plunder, 1 Samuel 15, in which the command was, do not take the plunder, right? And so I believe Saul did, right? Not just the plunder, but the king Agag. Right? And so they don't want to make that mistake.
Yeah.
That later on we're going to see that. But still, it's no adjustments at all to the decree. In essence, almost identical to counteract.
Yeah. So genocide turns into war.
Yeah. So, should I understand this as holy war, where Mordecai is appropriating that command of 1 Samuel 15?
I don't know. Bernard, what do you see here? How does this look to you?
I'm inclined towards is the term zero-sum equation, talking of the math that it was a situation where, given the animosity towards them, there wasn't scope to operate except in terms of the original terms, you know, the three that you mentioned. And, but I personally don't hold them to the same standards that I hold our country today, for instance, and the negotiations, the Geneva Accord and all of those sorts of things don't yet exist. And would we do any different? And so this is what they did. I don't think it's written to describe what they should have done. Now, it's been read that way subsequently, and they believe that they had the divine warrant. God did put them there for such an hour as this, and we have the opportunity, and one day wasn't enough, and so they unabashedly go ahead with it, and that's what we have here that is written, and I think it is appropriate that we ponder, because that's an indication that we have progressed from then, at least in theory, and that we are sensitized in manners which they were not, although there would be much in our society today that would give them pause too. We are inclined to feel that, you know, we do things right and everybody's always done it wrong. But
Yeah. In verse 11 of chapter 8, the thing is couched in clearly defensive terms, isn't it? They can gather together, and now if they defend their lives, they are not going against the king's will, which it looked like they would have been in the first version of this thing, right? And yet, as the story plays out, we read that the Jews are to be ready on that day, verse 13, to revenge themselves on their enemies. We've got some mission creep here, it seems to me. What do you think?
This is
We weren't there. The videotapes are missing, so it's hard
Right.
for us.
It's
You know.
difficult
We
material.
really
This
can't
is the
sit
Middle
here
East.
and pontificate on this or pass judgment. But the very fact that this is now warranted eventually to be carried forward for another 24-hour period
Right.
really makes us wonder. What really makes us wonder, as we will see when we next talk about this interesting story, is that it was really a pretty bloody scene. The numbers, however, and there are different versions of the numbers, as there so often are in the Old Testament, the numbers look horrific by any tally, don't they?
Right.
How are we to understand this? Now, we'll do more of this next time, but
A quick
impressions?
comment on that,
Yeah.
not at all to solve the ethical dilemma or legitimate
Yeah.
their
well.
actions.
Go
but-
ahead. And
But,
solve
but,
it.
but could it be that in their eyes, this kind of action was necessary in order to ensure the survival of Israel and the people of God? That the situation was so dangerous and precarious, and that it warranted this kind of drastic response to the edict in
Yeah.
order to ensure that.
I wonder if even the level of technology that is in play here backs up what you're saying. In other words, this was such a broad kingdom from Ethiopia, right, to India, right? So we have this huge geographical area. That's one reason why it requires time to plan, because simply the travel that's involved with getting the law, Haman's law out there, and now the horses are trying to catch up with Mordecai's law. So we have that huge scale that I think the story is inviting us to ponder the consequences of. So the stakes are extremely high.
Yeah.
Because they know that there's some horses ahead of their horses that are allowing for this annihilation to happen, and they're just as quickly trying to send their horses after it. So the stakes couldn't be higher in that regard.
You know, you're right to remind us, and I forget this. This is only a matter of a few days in between. 3, 4, we don't know exactly, but could have all played out, and as far as the commands are concerned, within a week, both directions, you know, the first and the second. Yeah.
Persian postal system was famous, but speed would not have been one of its main features. But at this time, of course, there were the horses that are dispatched to get it out. And the care and detail too, you know, coming from my background, in the right script and in the language of the various regions. That's a lot of work, from Sanskrit to Hebrew and everything else in between.
Yeah. Translations
Yes.
take a little time.
Yes.
So here we are in that first banquet at the very opening of the book. All of the delegations from each of these provinces have whichever kind of wine is their favorite. Yeah? This is clever rulership, I suppose. In some. Now here, they don't want any fuss at the destinations of these 127 provinces over the words. We'll continue this next time on Searching for Answers.